Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs.
We're about to see the dark side of Prime Minister Mark Carney's new trade deal with the communist regime in China. You remember back in January, Carney said he'd gone to Beijing, he'd gotten the tariffs on canola taken off by the Chinese in return for accepting about 50,000 electric vehicles made in China. Now, aside from the fact that that puts at threat hundreds of jobs in auto assembly plants in Ontario and Quebec, it also compromises our government's ability to stand up against Chinese human rights violations. Carney said there was a need for a reset, a recalibration of our relationship with China. We've been hostile too long. We need to be more pragmatic. Well, pragmatic means you have to accept an awful lot of human rights abuses by China and not do much about it. The first example of that we see this week in the sentencing of Jimmy Lei, a former Hong Kong newspaper owner, to 20 years in prison for violating what the Chinese call their national security law, which means he advocated for democracy in Hong Kong. He was a big fan of free speech, and he criticized the human rights record of the communist regime. Those, the Chinese said, or 3 judges handpicked by the Chinese regime said, were violations of the national security law. And they put Lei away for 20 years. Now, that's a death sentence. Jimmy Lei's 78 years old. The chances that he's going to make it out of jail alive after 20 years are pretty slim. And he has spent most of the last 5 years in solitary confinement while he was awaiting trial. That's the sort of compromise you make when you make a deal with the Chinese to send them more canola and for them to send us electric vehicles. The other thing about this is that China now is allowed to send agents. They won't call them agents, but that's what they'll be. National security agents and propaganda agents to Canada to try and pressure the Chinese community in Canada to be more outspoken in favor of the communist regime in Beijing. They put pressure on Canadian Chinese, sometimes by holding hostage their families back in China, to speak out favorably for the communist regime. It's disgusting. And some of their agents, of course, tried very hard in 2019 and 2021 to influence the outcome of our federal elections. They weren't trying to overturn the results. They weren't trying to make sure the Liberals won, but they were trying to make sure that there were plenty of MPs elected to the House of Commons who are favorable to China. That's how they work. And because of Mark Carney's trade deal with China, there is now no chance, or very little chance, that we will have a foreign agents registry that keeps that kind of activity from happening in Canada. That's the tragedy of the deal that Carney made. Now, Carney, though, has been an advocate, a Sinophile, as they say, an advocate for China for years, long before he became prime minister, back when he was the governor of the Bank of England, and then he was a representative of the United Nations. He was always a big fan of China, always believed that China was benevolent enough that we could make deals with them, we could do business with the Chinese. Well, I think we're about to see how unrealistic that is. And the first example is the way the Chinese are treating Jimmy Lei and the fact that the Canadian government can do very little about it. For Post Media, I'm Lorne Gunter.